welcome everyone. Good afternoon. We're going to get started. It's really wonderful to see all of you here. We have a great full house in person, and I know we've got a full Zoom house as well. I'm Marya Besharov. I'm Professor of Organizations and Impact at Said Business School, and I'm the Academic Director of the Skoll Centre for Social Entrepreneurship. I'm thrilled to welcome you here for today's Insights for Action seminar. The seminar series broadly explores how researchers and practitioners within and beyond Oxford are using research insights for action to work towards driving positive social impact. And today we're going to focus specifically on businesses and how businesses can be transformed from within to be more purposeful and to drive positive impact. We have a bunch of wonderful folks in the room, in the audience, but especially up here with me. I'm thrilled to welcome my conversation partners for today's conversation. Erinch Sahan, who is the Business and Enterprise Lead at Doughnut Economics Action Lab, or DEAL. Welcome. Erinch has been working for more than 10 years on transforming business in a variety of roles to be more regenerative and more distributive. And he's been looking at different ownership and governance models and the role that that can play. In addition to his role at DEAL, and prior to that role, he served as Chief Executive of the World Fair Trade Organization. He's also been at Oxfam, and he's worked in a number of large firms as well. So lots of interesting cross-sector experiences that we might dig into. And more recently, Erinch has taken on some board leadership roles as well, serving on the board of the Social Enterprise World Forum, among others. So welcome, Erinch. Also, Bruno Roche. Welcome, Bruno. You're not a stranger to this place at all. You've done a lot of work with Oxford over the years, but it's great to have you here with us in this conversation. Bruno has been really a pioneer in the impact economy for many years, perhaps best known for your work in founding the Economics of Mutuality, initially in your role with Mars, and then later on launching with Said Business School, the Economics of Mutuality program, which I've had the privilege of teaching on a few times in recent years. And now, though, you've more recently launched in 2024, One Society, which will unpack what that is and what you're doing there. Also, I'll leave that as a teaser. I should also say Bruno has been a close collaborator of one of the former deans of Said Business School, Colin Mayer, including co-editing Putting Purpose into Practice, which is a really wonderful line. Okay, and I should say you're also on the board of the UN Global Compact for the Principles for Responsible. I'm going to get the acronym.
I was just.
Anyway, and that's the context in which you know Tima, who I'll introduce. So Tima is a professor of sustainability and strategy at Ivey Business School. And she's really a pioneer and one of the leaders in the field of sustainability and organization theory and management scholarship. And so it's a real privilege to have you here, Tima. Tima is here on sabbatical for this next few months, and thank you for joining us for this conversation today. In addition to her really significant scholarly accomplishments on sustainability and organization theory, Tima has had a significant practical impact. She's been quite active in working on the Principles for Responsible Management Education and chairs the board of that group. She's also founded Innovation North, which we'll unpack a bit, which is working with companies on issues of sustainability over the long term. So welcome, Tima, and again, welcome to all of you. So we picked a quite ambitious topic for the discussion today, and also a somewhat potentially abstract one. So I want to start by talking about, what are we talking about? What do we need when we talk about redesigning business and the role of business? Why are we even having this conversation about the role of business in creating positive social and environmental impact? How do you think about that role? And I think you each have different, although perhaps complementary vantage points on that. So Erinch, I'll start with you. And tell us a bit about the perspective that Doughnut Economics Action Lab takes in terms of what is the role of business in catalyzing positive social and environmental impact.
Sure, thanks, Marya. I mean, our starting point is the Doughnut, and for those that don't know the Doughnut, it basically is a way of conceptualizing the two main boundaries that we must live within, our economy must live within. So on the outside, this big circle, which represents the 9 planetary Earth system. Scientists have told us we must not transform. And on the inside is a second concentric circle, which is the social foundation. These are the essentials of life. We need water, food, we need energy, livelihoods, all the things the economy must produce. So the goal is, how do we get into that donut, right? And business has that central role to play because it is the activities of business alongside others that have driven the fact that we are in significant overshoot its boundaries and we are in shortfall on life's essentials, whether it's fast fashion or the growth of the fossil fuel industry, or the way that urban development works, the way that manufacturing and electronics, the agricultural sector, you name it. Every sector has a transformation it needs to undergo. So then we started asking ourselves, what is it that is holding business back? If you sit down with the CEO of a fashion company, you could pretty quickly come up with a strategy for helping fashion to be a force for good, for a force to help humanity into the donut, but it probably wouldn't be able to integrate it into strategy tomorrow. And we started asking that question, and I worked with several hundred business leaders over a couple of years. So what's holding back? And one big thing we came up realize is that the way we've designed business to be in service to finance is a major barrier. And if we were to redesign it around its ownership models, its governance structures, its financial models, to deliberately pursue social and ecological benefits, we can unlock a huge range of ambition, huge range of solutions, huge range of benefits. So that's been our focus, is saying, right, start with the action that's needed, and let's understand that the major problem here has been we have designed business to be in service to finance and finance to be in service to itself. And if we reverse that logic and we start to have finance be in service of thriving boundaries and to be in service of businesses that are also pursuing that goal, we can come up with a formulation of business that is actually moving us towards the kind of transitions and transformations that, to be honest, needed to happen yesterday.
Okay, so and I think it's striking, you're starting kind of with the system, right? And think about, well, what do we really need, right? What's the transformation we need? What's the context we're operating in? And then how might we change the way business operates and is financed to get there? Is that a fair characterization?
Exactly.
Yeah, okay, so let's go to you, Bruno, because you're starting, or well, I think you're now talking about the system a lot, but the economics and mutuality work, it's very much, as I understand it, grounded in organizations, if you will, from the inside out, looking at the system. So tell us a little bit about that approach and where you started, why you started it, how you thought at the economics and mutuality about the role of business, and then we'll get into how that's evolved.
Well, thank you. And in a sense, we have a nice dialogue with Doughnut Economics, because essentially we started almost 20 years ago with a real business question. Actually, I was just appointed chief economist at Mars. I was the new kid in town. And I remember I had a kind of unusual conversation with the chairman of the board at that time, the CEO, and they asked me what should be the right level of profits. And it's kind of oh shit moment. Okay? And because immediately I thought, well, maybe I can just go back to my friends at BCG or McKinsey. We do a benchmarking, and eventually, given where we are, that's the right level of profit. Okay. But essentially, I said, I think it's a deeper question. So I responded, maybe like a philosopher. I said, why are you asking me this question? And eventually, the reason why we're asking this question was very, very business. I said, well, you see, if we think of a business is like a value chain, right? A chain is as solid as its weakest link. And if the weakest link breaks somewhere, eventually the whole ecosystem from which I depend will be disrupted, and I could go bankrupt. But at the same time, I need to ensure that I don't take too much, that I don't abuse my power relationship, to ensure that actually my supplier, my customer will not break down. At the same time, I also need to make enough money because I need profits to sustain the competition still. So it was a real business question. What should be the right level of profit? And actually, I'm grateful that they asked me this question, because it started the project from a completely different footing. It was not about looking less bad, right? It was not about trying to report and trying to internalize some externalities. No, it was a real business question. But to my surprise, that this question hasn't been studied in business or in economics. Nothing. The only response was essentially maximize your profit as much as possible, okay? Which we are all familiar with. But of course, it was not the right answer. So I had to go beyond. I had to go to philosophy, to history, to even theology in order to get some thinking. And eventually I came back with a proposal, which to my surprise, the board accepted. Because I said, essentially, traditionally, we talked about, we make money one way, right? And then we spend it the other way. So essentially, we make a distinction between value creation and value distribution. And we assume actually you need to make your money first before you share it. I said, what if we actually embed the principle of sharing, of mutuality, within the value creation process? And to see how eventually this hypothesis would lead. Would it lead to a better system, a safe system, or a worse system? And that's actually how it started. So, and they looked at me and said, yeah, go for it. And that was kind of another oh shit moment. Now I have to do it. So essentially it took about 15 years, to be fair, to come up with what I would say a management methodology, a management innovation, which is eventually we managed to demonstrate that when you embed this concept of value creation, value sharing within the value creation processes, and you are managing performance according to not only financial capital, but also other form of capital, social, human, natural, and that you are using the power of business and the language of accounting to manage this new form of capital with the same level of intentionality and focus that you are managing financial capital, then you end up not only with, of course, a business which is more responsible in terms of its impact, but also you end up with a model which actually is superior in terms of just economic performance. And that was actually a very interesting outcome, which actually is documented in the books that we wrote with Colin. And it's a good news, because essentially, I just would like to say that I wanted to finish with this, but I will say now. I shared this anecdote with Tima last night. We had a wonderful dinner. And they said, you see, Colin Mayer actually did a few years ago a very interesting study. He looked at how we are describing the concept of enterprise, okay? And we either call it company or we call it business. And actually, 20 years ago, the word company was a dominant word in the literature. And now we talk more about business, okay? And actually, we are in a business school, okay? But you know, company is a word that comes from Latin, which literally comes from two words, com, panes, which literally means the sharing of the bread. Okay, so when you run a company, you are managing an organization which is all about sharing the bread, which is all about fellowship, communion. Okay, it's a very loaded symbolic word. Whereas business is actually coming from the old English word, which means business, which actually means anxiety. So essentially, over the years, over the decade, we moved from a situation where an enterprise was meant to be a place where you are nurturing fellowship to a place which maximizes anxiety.
Okay, and economics and mutuality was getting us back to the company.
Exactly, and what we managed to demonstrate that, of course, developing transactional relationship with your customer, with your supplier, with your stakeholders, essentially a system that creates financial value. No problem with it. Similar actually to slavery. Slavery is also a great economic model. But if we want we replace this concept of transactional relationship with mutual relationship, which is all about taking into account the needs of the other, okay, and to position your company as a way to profit from creating solutions and not profiting from creating problems, then you end up from an economic perspective to a higher level of equilibrium, and for the company itself, enterprise, a higher level of performance, which actually could be measured through not only top line and bottom line, which actually is a traditional way of measuring performance, but also more and more through resilience. And as we're moving into a period of lots of uncertainty, building resilient organization is, in my view, a critical component of performance.
Okay, I'm going to come back to what we mean by resilience, but I want to bring Tima into this. So, Erinch, you started us off with the donut, right, and very much so, very explicitly, sort of a systems perspective. And Bruno, you too, from the inside out, right? Even just thinking about Mars as a company, right? That's a system and it's embedded in a bigger system. And I know, Tima, systems are central to how you have thought about your research and all of the engagement you've been doing with companies. So tell us a little bit about how each of these approaches resonates with your research or how you're going in a different direction, and unpack this for us.
So I think that Erinch and Bruno are incredibly enlightened, and they offer a perspective of the world that we need, the perspective of the world that we should have. And this is where I pause, is that I'm not sure it's a perspective of the world as it is, and that we are in a world of busyness and anxiety. And in fact, the anxiety is escalating over time. And so as we start to see more and more uncertainty, and the uncertainty that business has created, uncertainty related to climate, uncertainty related to technology like AI, what does business do? Almost everyone, when they face anxiety, they turn inwards. And it's a threat rigidity response that when we tend to be threatened, we actually shorten our point of view. We shorten our time horizon. So we only start to look at the next day or the next quarter and then the next month. And then soon it's just the next daily stock price that business will look at. And then not only that, we not only look temporally short, but we also look spatially short when more egocentric. So it's about what I can get, what I as a business can have. And I think that's the world of today. And now I'm Canadian, but I look south of the border, and what just happened election was truly mind-blowing to me. And I don't know, I assume that we're among friends that have similar points of view, that I just don't understand how that was possible. So something has changed in the world where I believe that we are having much more of this threat rigidity response. And so, whereas I believe that we need donut economics, we need the economics of mutuality, I'm not sure that that's where business is. And so I think that what we need to do is to figure out not the transformation, but the transition. How do we get from here to there? What is the next step to get organizations to stop doing this and start doing that? And I think that that's really critical, because until they can start doing that, until they can start looking long-term, are they able to do that? So the initiative that I started 5 years ago was called Innovation North. And we only called it Innovation North because we're in Canada.
Oh, okay.
And it's like, we the North. I don't know if you know anything about basketball. We finally won a basketball tournament against the Americans. And it was always we the North. Anyway, so Innovation North was a new form of innovation that was taking companies to where they are now and saying, how do we move things forward so that you can widen your perspective? You don't do that by saying we need to be better. What we do is to say, imagine if we have purpose, and that purpose then gives us this long-term perspective. But then all we have to do is to think about the next step. To keep the long-term in mind about donuts or about mutuality, then what we have to do is just say, what's the next step? The next step gives them a systems perspective. And when the system is so disruptive, that what you want them to do is to say, okay, let's just figure out how we can build the next product, the next service, the next business model that will allow us to do the next step. So I'm just going to give you an example. So I think that this is where we can get companies to where they are now. So an insurance company, huge losses right now. I don't even need to illustrate the losses that they're experiencing. The wildfires that Marya was just in California. So billions and billions of losses in just one event now. The insurance companies are facing these major losses, and this one insurance company says, what can we do now in small incremental movements? And so with this a systems approach, they're able to say, so the way the business model works in insurance is that you sell premiums, and then you take that money in premiums, which is a highly competitive market. So you want more and more people, but it's also priced at a very, very low margin. And then you have to deal with the claims later. You can understand what that is. And as the claims go up, then there's this disconnect between the premiums that they have now and the claims. This one company thought, okay, so how can we bring just the next step forward? So let's not strip the drywall when there's a flood and all the soft carpets, so all the materials that come when there's a flood. Let's see if there's a different way of fixing a building rather than just stripping it and sending all the materials to landfill. So they built something called drying in place. So instead of stripping the materials, all they do is remove the water really quickly. And when you move the water really quickly, you don't have to remove the materials. It just dries in place. There's no mold. And in doing that, they were able to lower costs. They were able to actually keep people in their homes. They were able to lower costs, keep people in the homes, and save less stuff going to landfill and then extraction of virgin materials. These simple and small movements that work with a system, I think, is a way to get to mutuality and to get to donut economics.
I love that example on so many levels, but it combined, like, we started with the long-term perspective, right? And then, okay, but then what can we do now, right? So this combination and the both and of the long-term and the short-term and a very practical step, right? That's really grounded in sort of innovation at the product level in that case, but not disembedded from the system in which it's operating. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, so, and you've gotten us into this now, this conversation about like, how do we do this, right? How do we make that and help companies or businesses become companies, to use your language, right? How do we help them make that transition? So I want to share a little bit about how you do this in the Doughnut Economics Action Lab. Who are you working with? How are you working with them? What are the kinds of things on the ground practically that you're getting companies to start doing?
So we scanned the landscape and looked at all the different initiatives going on, and there seemed to be a plethora of activity around ways of working with companies, finding efficiencies, finding productivity improvements, addressing risks, etc. There's some really great work happening working with the system or with the current incentive structures. And we felt like we don't need to replicate that. What can we do that would be additional and hopefully pretty transformative and helpful to the broader agenda? So what we thought we'd ask is, rather than what is the commercially viable thing we can discover that would have a business case to make some improvements on ecological and social things, which is great work that others are doing, what is the thing you can't do? What is the thing you know you need to do but you can't do? So asking the question, what is that idea that's in the back of your mind as a business leader that you know in your heart of hearts that you need to do? You need to transform pretty radically. And you know the system is against you, that it's too risky to attempt this. The investment is too large. The shift is too big and too challenging. And you're just better off delaying this if you look at it purely from this sort of short-term horizon landscape. And what we ended up creating was a tool that allows business leaders the space to ask themselves that question. What is it that I know I actually need to do here? And if you're coming up with things you can do already, you haven't thought hard enough. If you're coming up with things that feel safe and there's a business case and it's commercially viable, you haven't thought hard enough. If that's the case, then go do that anyway. You don't need to be in a Doughnut economics workshop. But what are the things that you're almost too afraid to say out loud? Because it would be career limiting, or you would seem financially and commercially naive. And when you write those things down, there might be social things like, well, I know that the prices I pay in my supply chain make it impossible for anyone to escape poverty. I know that the product designs I have are creating a lot of additional sales, but it's essentially a version of built-in obsolescence, and I'm creating huge waste on the back of it. Whatever you're addicted to that is actually driving high short-term profits, let's find the alternatives to that and let's write them down. Now, once they do that, what happens is two things. It's not a list of impossible to do, actions, but it ends up testing the design, stress testing the design of their company. Because you start saying, well, what's stopping you then? What's holding you back from making that investment, from shifting your business model, from tolerating the low margin, medium term horizon on that you need to transition? And part of the reason ends up being, well, the way we are designed, our ownership model. If I'm owned by private equity, they're looking for an exit in the next 5 to 7 years. they're not going to tolerate this sort of approach. If I've accepted venture capital investment as a startup, then I am on a trajectory to be pushed as hard as I can, as fast as I can, to becoming a unicorn. And if that breaks me, that breaks me. You know, and that's what I've locked my enterprise design into, because that's what the ownership and governance model that has been implanted on me is doing. If I'm listed on the share market, this is the constraint of quarterly earnings, of daily stock price movements. So by outing those structural barriers, what we're trying to drive is a conversation about the realities of the limits of the design of businesses and how we might need to then evolve those designs. So we've created this tool. It's in the Creative Commons. Anyone can look at it. Anyone can use it. If you're a business leader, use it yourself. It's out there, Doughnut Economics. Down themes for business and enterprise. If you're a consultant or a business network or someone, so businesses, a business school, 107 now organizations that are registered as values aligned users of this. If you're a very large consultancy, we have additional rules to protect the integrity of it. So do check that out. But organizations like Impact Hubs are being trained to use it with entrepreneurs. Organizations like the Specialty Coffee Association is using it regularly with their members. Chambers of Commerce, you know, values-based, values-aligned consultancies. And we create webinars. I do support sessions. We create new materials, publish case studies to help them run workshops with business leaders, but willing and able to ask the question, what is the most ambitious thing I actually need to do? And how will the design of my business need to evolve? That second question takes you into a really exciting area of innovation, because then you start asking questions like, should I move to a steward ownership model where I've got different share classes and there's a limit to the extraction? Should I move towards being employee owned or a hybrid model, partly employee owned? Should I look at models from the social enterprise movement? Should I look at nature on my board? Should I look at having stakeholders represented? Should I have a model where there's a limit to how much profit can be extracted so that there's an internal reinvestment model that's going to enable these sorts of ideas? So you start liberating more and more ideas by having a structural conversation about enterprise design in order to push forward the most ambitious version of the transition. And I agree with Tima that, you know, most businesses aren't there. And most people in the business world, especially if you're owned by private equity, controlled by venture capital, publicly listed with very diverse shareholdings across the world, you don't really have the agency, even if you're a CEO, to push that conversation. But there are lots of companies that are privately owned, that are family owned. Every day a new business is being established. If we could rewind the clock back 25 years and had that conversation, titans of Silicon Valley, imagine if they looked like Wikipedia rather than Facebook or Google today. It is possible to start shaping those conversations. And I'm also, just to finish off, I don't actually believe we're going to incrementally and voluntarily go around the world fixing all the world's business design problems. I think we're getting to a tipping point where these alternative models are demonstrating something else is possible. And policymakers are starting to see the potential of this. In the UK, there's been a tax break for employee ownership that has led to 37% growth in the last year. In the city of Leuven, there's a new fund to support steward-owned startups. And if you're interested in steward ownership, it's a model of saying essentially that we're going to separate power and dividend rights in the share classes. Patagonia essentially modeled that. There's a whole host of Northern European examples. There are new models of public procurement and legal forms that are coming out to support these alternative enterprises. So it's starting to shift. There's an ecosystem that's building and getting confidence from that organic evolution of enterprises, demonstrating that this broken 20th century, everything in service to finance and investors model, there's something else we could create instead. And look at these diverse alternatives that are showing that these are viable market-based models that with the right ecosystem can actually come to restructure our whole economy.
Okay, great. So you brought us from the sort of innovation in the short term, right, where Tina's working with companies in Innovation North, right? Think long term, but what can we do today? And you're saying, well, okay, fine, but some of those things aren't possible or certainly made more difficult by our current ownership and governance structures. And there is a whole host of innovations out there, and we're just starting at the Skoll Centre to do some work on this. on shared ownership models, purpose trust, stewardship models, et cetera. Lots of innovation at that level, which can facilitate, although some companies are already doing this without that, presumably. And I think a little bit sort of that journey from Tima's comments to yours has some similarities with your journey from the economics of mutuality to what you're doing now. So tell us a little bit about One Society and the work you're doing now, which I think is really taking on some of these more systemic and structural challenges.
Yeah, and actually, I really like to echo what you said, Erinch, that it is incredibly difficult for a CEO to move outside the status quo. And it's not a judgment that I say. I mean, I think the same proportion of good and bad people in every single segment of population. But we are typically here in a prisoner's dilemma, okay? Even if everybody agrees that there is a higher level of equilibrium, the cost of getting there alone is too high. And we have many examples of CEOs who have pushed the boundaries a bit too far, like Paul Polman, with the chairman of this university, also Faber, Danone, and many others. So essentially, there is how is it possible to create an environment which is conducive for business leaders to move into the right space of value creation? Because don't get me wrong, we are not talking here about degrowth. We are talking about the next frontier of value creation. I mean, when I want to teach economics to people who know nothing about economics, I tell them, listen, economics could be summarized as the management of scarcities. 50 years ago, financial capital was scarce. The natural resources were overly abundant. So 50 years ago, it made sense to have a financial capitalistic approach to the economy. Today, just the opposite. Financial capital is overly abundant. It's not shared properly, but it's overly abundant. I mean, I live in Switzerland, and long time ago, we had negative interest rates. And like in my PhD in finance, to me, negative interest rate is absurd. It is as if you told me that the law of gravity doesn't work. And yet, we had negative interest rates, which actually is a sign that there was so much liquidity. But we have other form of scarcities in the system. And yet, our economic system has not adjusted. We are still producing in excess something which is in excess. So guess what? I mean, the economic system will adjust. It will usually adjust through catastrophic event or wars or civil wars, or you can adjust through education, experimentation, research. And essentially, the smart companies are the ones which are capable of addressing these scarcities and turn this into a new value creation process. Okay, so I'm talking here really about a new value creation, the next frontier of value creation. However, how is it possible to turn this into something that actually there is kind of no risk for the people who embrace it? And I must share my personal experience, actually. I come from the corporate world. I come from Mars. Okay, Mars here on the Earth.
Yes.
I have no intention of colonizing Mars. Okay? And also, I mean, I also have a strong academic background. And I thought naively that if we create a product like a methodology which is approved by Oxford and OUP, check, tested in one of the most iconic corporate America organization, and then I hired actually a former McKinsey partner to just sell it like a McKinsey product. It would actually take off, and I just have to enjoy my movement taking off. It didn't really work. I mean, we had a lot of good conversation, and we had a lot of people who were even willing to give us a bit of business at the periphery of their activity, but never inside. Okay, and it really put me off. And actually, at one stage, I had an interesting conversation with the governor of a large region in Southern Europe. And he's been a friend for a long time. Actually, he was visiting Oxford several times, and he was following the work we're doing. And he called me one day. He said, hey, is it possible to transform this economics of mutuality model that we developed for a company, but for a city or for a region or territory? And I really found the question very insightful, which we did. And eventually it's possible. And eventually, I will not cut a long story short. The guy was a pure politician, so he managed to convince his local government to vote for this new methodology. And eventually, I suddenly realized actually that you see, a CEO is wired to think in a linear value chain model. And it's very difficult for a CEO to think beyond a linear value chain model. So it's very difficult for them to embrace this concept of system thinking that you're talking about. A mayor, a governor, from the outset thinks in ecosystem way, okay? And actually, he's not only focusing on financial capital, he's also looking at the well-being and the territory, etc. So, and eventually, they also have this convening capability to bring different stakeholders together. And to my surprise, actually, this man actually managed to change, in a sense, the local policy. And he used this local policy to have an informed conversation with the companies operating on this territory. He said, you want to have a partnership with the region? Fine. These actually are the list of things you have to comply with. If you want to have access to land, if you want to have access to infrastructure, and actually, that was actually, and the conversation I had with the business leaders of these companies was suddenly changed, because it is as if they were waiting for an excuse to have a meaningful conversation with their leadership and their board. And to me, it was like an illustration of actually, it's possible to have a systemic approach, but at the level of a territory, which eventually brings companies together. So the point of entry here is not the company itself, it is the local leaders of a local government who understand actually the limits of the Doughnut, right? And he's using, in a sense, his convening capabilities, but also his in a sense, his capability to, in a sense, negotiate actually the access to some critical asset that the company needs to change. But it is a policy-making exercise, which eventually leads to a business model evolution. And in my view, and I don't want to spend time on this, but I have many examples, and you can find it on the book we wrote with Colin, many examples that when you position your company as to say, the purpose of my company is to profit from creating solutions to a problem that exists in the ecosystem. Actually, sometimes is even unknown to me. The example that comes to my mind is Novo Nordisk. Novo Nordisk was a company which actually was all in the business of selling insulin to treat diabetes. Okay, so it's actually not too bad. It's better to do this than selling tobacco, right? But at the same time, there was a few leaders in the organization that actually, what is the real purpose of Novo Nordisk? Is it to sell more insulin, or is it to eradicate diabetes? And it's a very different question. And eventually, there was a group of people who said, why don't we choose the purpose of eradicating diabetes? Which actually is a very interesting proposition, because it meant that they chose the purpose, which meant the end of the business they had today. So it's an extreme example, okay? But nevertheless, the case study that we wrote on this showed actually that it led to a stream of innovations, which actually not only benefited the top line and bottom line of the company, but also, this is the point of resilience, it created an ecosystem of relationship beyond actually the traditional stakeholders of being a supplier and customer. And the point of relationship this way, when you are building mutual relationship with a number of stakeholders, you see, it's easy to copy a product. It's also easy to copy a strategy. It's impossible to copy a relationship. And when you are building your business such a way that you are building a network of meaningful mutual relationship, you are creating an organization which actually is more resilient, because it also creates barriers for entry.
Okay.
Can I take that? I just want to build on that example of Novo Nordisk. So Novo Nordisk, as you know, was the one that has Ozempic and Wegovy. And so here, Wegovy. And so they've done brilliantly. In fact, they have so much money. Talk about ownership. Yep. They are owned by foundations. So they keep purpose in mind. It's still a profit-oriented company, but the profits go up to the foundation, which is charitable. And they're trying to improve healthcare in Denmark. They have so much money now that they can't give it in Denmark because they're shaping public policy because they have more money than the government does. And it's such a fantastic story, but they had lost their way.
Will they buy Greenland?
Well, they buy the Greenland, protect Greenland. But the other interesting thing was it's not that long ago that they had lost their way. They had lost their purpose.
Yeah.
And Mats Ovlesen, who was the CEO at the time, is often considered to be the father of CSR. He says, we can't lose our purpose. And so what he had every single person do at Novo Nordisk is to go out and spend time with someone with diabetes. And being close to the person with diabetes helped them regain that purpose that they felt that they had lost. And I think that's one of the hardest things with purpose is that it's out there. Now, many of you might be at the University of Oxford. Do you know the purpose? At the Ivey Business School? I sort of know the purpose. I can't tell you the words are. I'll tell you, does Shell Canada, do they know their purpose? Shell, do they know their purpose? Does Walmart know its purpose? Was it low cost? Something, right? And I feel like purpose is one of those things that we can lose. And purpose, though, has to be long-term, has to be aspirational, and has to be on the minds of everybody every day. And that's what's really hard, I think, is that we can lose that long-term sight as we start to chase those profits that we all have to do, right? I'm
Okay.
sorry, I interrupted. I was
that's great.
just really
was
excited about the
asking
Novo Nordisk
a different
example.
question, which I'm now going to ask you. So, because Bruno, you talked about essentially first finding a leverage point in mayors, right?
Yep.
Your work, okay, economics and neutrality, but it wasn't really getting picked up by corporations. But then here was a position and a role and a set of people who were open to it and happened to be a leverage point sort of in the system,
Okay.
right? And the reason that was important is in part because the business leaders and the CEOs didn't feel like they had permission, right, or the space to do it. And I think, the Novo Nordisk example is a good one because I think for the current leadership, there hasn't been an easy time of it, right? Even trying to do this, but mixed perceptions, right? And so my question to you, Tima, coming from a business school, and we're sitting at a business school, what's our role as business schools, as people who educate the future CEOs in helping to make this shift?
My goodness.
Wow, that's a really tough
Yeah,
one,
yeah.
Mariah. And I have to say kudos to Mariah's group. I really do. I've been here for 3 weeks. I'll be here for 3 more months. But I am so impressed with what's happening here because I think that there is a real connection to business, a real deeper relationship than I think most business schools have. And I think certainly in North America. So I know that I've known Bruno now for a few years, and I know that both of us really care deeply about education. And I think that education is certainly a pathway to change, but I don't think it's a quick pathway. And I think some of the challenges that we have right now in business right now in the world, and these are macro systems. So whether we're dealing with climate, which I really, natural resource depletion, biodiversity loss, or we're dealing on the social side of inequality and growing inequality, in fact, crazy inequality, or even the impact of what technology is going to do to us and our jobs and future of work. There are so many things out there that we have to address. I don't know if education is going to address it fast enough. So what's our role? This is where I think the Skoll Centre is so amazing, is that we need, and think in business schools, it's to be engaged. And it's when we have folks like you and you become the seeds of change when you're engaging in business, that we start to see those influences in real time, because we can't stay in ivory towers anymore. Doesn't mean, though, that we become co-opted by business, that we as education, as people in the business school, we have to remain that objective, critical insight that will be new, that will challenge the status quo. Because I'm going to go back to this notion of the prisoner's dilemma. It's just easier to follow what everybody else is doing, right? And it does not get us to the place that we want to get to. And I think that right now we're at risk of everybody doing the same thing. And one of the biggest risks we have, we were talking about this at dinner as well. You know what I think is the biggest risk right now is social media. And it's when I see people on Instagram, and this isn't new to anybody, but when I see people on Instagram that live better than I do and are having nice meals at restaurants, that I want what they have. And then when you have these senior executives, these entrepreneurs, there are billions and billions of dollars, they're all standing in front of Trump trying to get even more money. That's the virus. That's the virus that we have to address. And I think the only way that we address that virus is that we have folks in business schools that can challenge the status quo, but we can't do that within the ivory tower. It has to be engaged education.
It's a very tricky line, I think, right? Because being engaged without being co-opted is tricky. And one of our early seminars, we had Wendy Smith, who's a co-author friend who's done a lot of work on paradox in both, and Charmian Love, who's one of our execs in residence. And we had this conversation about tightrope walking and how to make sure you sort of thread the needle with being engaged and yet being critical and challenging at the same time. And I think that's what we're about. It's not easy. I've got a lot more questions, but I know you all have questions. So I want to open it up to questions from people in the room. And also, if you're joining us online, please type your questions into the chat. Mary.
I can start.
Do we need a mic for you?
Okay,
Great. I'll just pass it around.
Is everyone here? So I just wanted to pick up on something that I think was in the background of each of your comments. And it was actually, Bruno, you put it into words, right? So you talked about, if I'm right, economics as the kind of management of scarcity, or at least that's one framework through which we can think about what economics is. And I wondered if we might enter into a conversation about that. And particularly, I'm thinking about your role when you're working with fair trade, right? This idea of scarcity. Is it the case that we're thinking about allocation of scarce resources, or is the scarcity mindset not serving us any longer? Right. And this gets to the kind of envy mindset that you're talking about with some of the social media and TikTok. So I guess to put it into one framework, I just wanted to say, could you reflect a little bit on how our mindset around economics as the management of scarcity influences our decisions, and how you've seen that in your work, both practical and theoretical? I think it's a really interesting kind of concept to challenge and to get into conversation with.
So I think, I mean, one story really comes to mind. I was in India, and one of the members that were really impressive was a social entrepreneur who was running an enterprise called Last Forest, and they were running a business basically using the resources of the forest to make soap bars and to make other natural items that they would export around the world. And I think it was just under €1 million per annum turnover at the time. And I remember talking to Matthew John, the CEO at the time, about, look, I love seeing these amazing enterprises. I love the way you treat your workers and the artisans and the local community, and you clearly respect the barriers and boundaries of the local resources. Let's get you more investment. Let's scale this. Let's grow this. And I went, and the next time I ran sort of a conference for the World Fair Trade Organization, I brought in all these impact investors from around the world, and eventually Matthew pulled me aside and said, Erinch, what you saw was probably the right size of business for the ecology and for the impact that we wanted to have. And it kind of dawned on me that, maybe the growth mindset doesn't work in all contexts, but which business is established in a way to pursue sufficiency and to pursue the right size? So sometimes when I run these workshops with business leaders and I ask them, how big should your business be? No one knows how to answer that question. And if they're trying to attract investment, then it's a dangerous question to answer, because it puts a limit on the potential exit of the investor, for instance. So I learned two things from Matthew. One was that maybe scaling needs to, well, three things. One is that maybe scaling needs to be based on replication rather than on growth of an individual entity. The second was, how would we need to design businesses that had the freedom to pursue that mindset and to be in relationship with their local ecology? And the third was, and I had only not that long ago worked at Procter & Gamble and seen just how disparate the corporate decision-making could be. The third was that if you're running a business and you're serious about purpose and impact, and you start to be abstracted from your impacts, then you're not really able to do this meaningfully anymore. If it's a spreadsheet in headquarters and someone's reviewing it, that's different than Matthew seeing, local workers at the mosque on a Friday or at the church on a Sunday or at the Hindu temple, where he has to face them, he has to engage, and it's beyond just the market relationship. There's a community relationship there that's reinforcing the purpose and the power structure beyond what's written on words in the articles or in the market transactions and contracts. So that was the biggest lesson I learned on what does it look like to build businesses that can work within the scarcity of resources that are the reality around us, and how can they be genuinely locked into a purpose that is respecting those boundaries. We're going to have to, the relationship with finance that a regular startup has would never allow Matthew to run his business in that way. They would have destroyed that mindset pretty quickly, probably gotten rid of him, pushed him out. And so if we're going to ask any of those questions, it feels like number one question is, what's the relationship between finance and the business? And what is it going to allow and what's it not going to allow? And hence this almost obsession I have with redesigning that relationship. Where are the seeds of hope and innovation that are redesigning that relationship between the business and its financiers, and how that can create at least a space for something different to emerge?
I'll just add one thing. I'm working on a project in a very different context, a very small fledgling organization in Buffalo, New York, that was working to revitalize the east side of Buffalo, which had been depressed and sort of neglected for decades. And so it's a context where those constraints of the expectation of finance don't hold, right? But what we can see there is, how did the entrepreneurs who founded this organization, how did they deal with the very real scarcity that was there in that environment? And it was by adopting more of an abundance mindset.
More of what?
An abundance mindset.
Yeah.
What can we build from what we have here? How can we regenerate what is here? And that's what we learn when we go to these contexts that aren't constrained. And then, of course, the question is, how do we take that to the contexts that are constrained and shift that?
And actually, I like to add maybe an anecdote, because I love this kind of stories. Before I launched One Society, I decided to take a sabbatical. And what I did, actually, I went back to study ancient languages, Hebrew and Greek. And my background in theology, so I wanted to go back to my roots. Maybe I had to do this to reinvent my purpose. And eventually I asked my Hebrew teacher, I said, what is the word for economy in Hebrew? Because in Greek, it's economia, which actually literally means the management of the household. So the household is where you have limited resources, and essentially you are, in a sense, managing limited resources, not really scarce, but limited resources. And she told me, well, in Hebrew, it's a word with kalkala, which literally means the reception of abundance. Do you see the different mindsets? So on one side, you say, well, economy is about management of limited resources, which eventually leads to competition, the fear of lack, okay? Which eventually leads to any kind of dysfunctional behavior. But if you put yourself as it's a reception of abundance, of plenty, it changes your perspective. And of course, there are nevertheless some, and I think the dialogue between scarcity and abundance is where actually innovation lies. It's a true story.
Hey, I have a question. I think it's on. Okay. Bruno, right?
Yes.
Okay. So you mentioned that you talked about the mayors, right?
Yeah.
And that there are cities that are interested in this model, the economics of mutuality, which I'm not that familiar with, but I'm going to learn about it after the session. So I'm really glad that I came. But I'm also curious about whether these mayors or cities are concerned at all about not being competitive globally if they implement, and again, I'm not familiar with the model, so maybe I'm making assumptions about what's involved, but if they implement some of these changes that you're talking about.
No, what I wanted to say, and at the moment, it's an observation based on about 3 to 4 case studies, okay? But what I said is actually this prisoner dilemma that we talked about is stronger if you talk to a CEO of a company than if you talk to a mayor of a city. I think it's because a CEO is wired, is trained, and is expected to extract financial value from a value chain, right? And focusing primarily on delivering financial capital. And all the rest is secondary. Might be important, but secondary, because it is actually the rule of the game works this way. The mayor or a governor actually, from the outset, thinks differently. He has to manage different form of capital, and also he's also there to manage different stakeholders, okay? So essentially, he may still have a competitive mindset, and I'm sure they have politicians and even worse than business people sometimes, but they have to handle a much more complex and systemic set of issues. And I found actually the conversation easier with people in charge of a territory when it comes to building a mutual economic model than I had with business people. And it, again, it's not a judgment about the quality or the moral quality of the people I deal with. I think the same proportion of bad and good people on politicians and business people, but it's more about the context in which they operate. And to go back to your point, I think it's I'm going to use what you explained. You can use it as a leverage, okay? And in a sense, it goes back also to this concept of systemic thinking, right? Because if you have a systemic problem, you need to pull multiple levers. One lever will not work. So trying just to work with companies one by one, actually, it's not going to make, okay, you can change a few, but it's not going to change the system. But if you pull the trigger of education, okay, you pull the trigger of policymaking, you pull the trigger of cities, you pull the trigger of some companies, eventually over time, you create a narrative which eventually becomes compelling. That's my modest and pragmatic view. Okay. Okay.
Hi, my name is Matt. I do something called the Centre for Greening Finance and Investment, based at the Smith School here in Oxford. We work closely with our business school colleagues. But really exciting conversation. I couldn't agree more with the direction that we need to move in, but also the challenges that we face, particularly right now. And one thing that gives me a little bit of hope is the recent focus around transition plans and transition planning. And in particular, the realization that in financial markets, lots of investment firms have set their own portfolio targets to reduce their own emissions. But what's becoming really apparent is that it's less about your own emissions. It's more about what you can do to help reduce the global emissions in the real economy. So I think we're at a unique moment in time that, you know, as firms start to pull out of sort of net zero alliances, it's provoking this conversation. What is the role of finance? You know, is it just about reducing its own emissions and meeting its own targets, or is it actually to contribute towards the real economy, to transition? And I think that's arisen over the course of a decade, from recognizing that climate is a risk and now getting into this conversation around systemic resilience. So it's just a flag. I think we're at a really interesting time, but if we are to make the most of that, I think we also have to really think about metrics and measurements, right? Because if we're going beyond measuring just the financial bottom line and a firm's contribution, then how do we think about doing that? So I don't know if the panel had, you know, any thoughts around how do we find the metrics and the targets that we need if we're not going to count carbon and we're not necessarily going to think about just about return on capital.
Go ahead.
Well, I'm not going to answer it. I'm going to tee up that we're doing a lot of work in this space,
Yeah.
At sort of different levels. So some at the quite macro system level with Karim Harji, who's one of our visiting fellows or fellows of the center, but also at the super micro on the ground level, because at both levels, the question is like, what are the meaningful ways of measuring things, right? And so, you know, where you're talking about, it's like, how do we shift from sort of firm or even industry to system, measuring system level impact? And that's a big piece of work that we're in the early stages of. But also for people on the ground, and this gets back to or organizations working on the ground, that connecting to the people closest to the work or the people closest to the impact, we often don't do enough of that, right? And so that's what meaningful looks like at that level. So not an answer, but we are working on this, and it will continue to be a conversation that we have in these seminars over the coming year. So we're at time. Thank you all so much for coming, those of you here in the room, and thanks to those of you who joined online. Those of you who are here, we will have a reception afterwards, so please stay and join us for some more conversation. And I also encourage you to join us in February. We have a special Valentine's Day seminar. I don't know if the theme fits or not on building ethical enterprises. So please join us then. And thank you again, Erinch, Bruno, and Tima for a really rich conversation. Thank you.